In the previous lesson, we learned that a CSS rule is made up of two parts: the selector and the declaration. So we've seen quite a few different declarations, but the only selector we've learned is the tag selector. There are other choices, and they can be composed together in interesting and useful ways. So let's learn some more CSS selectors. So the first is the tag selector. We've seen already this one. So a CSS selector can consist of solely a single tag, so without punctuation or spacing, and this will be applied to any matching tags on the page. So this is an example of that. So every list item will have this kind of style or in your HTML document. And the next type is the ID selector. So you may remember the ID attribute, or this is short for identifier, and this attribute can be applied to an HTML tag to uniquely identify the element. So recall that the value for any given ID attribute can only appear once in a document. So no two tags are allowed to have the same ID. So you may also recall that the ID cannot contain spaces, nor most punctuation, nor begin with numbers. In this HTML example, there are two paragraph tags and if we want to style them individually, we can apply unique ID attribute to the paragraphs. So here, the first paragraph, we use the ID attribute and give it a value of P18. And the same with paragraph 2, but with this, we use different ID name, since we cannot have two identical ID value. So to style them in the CSS, we will use the ID selector. So the ID selector is simply a hash sign followed directly by the ID. So this is the result of that. So for the first paragraph, since we set a property, we use the property color and give it a value of blue. And of course, on the result, the whole paragraph should be in color blue. And the same with the second paragraph, on which we set the value of the color property to green. The class attribute is similar to the ID. However, whereas the ID must be unique and singular, the values of the class attribute can be shared by multiple tags. And multiple classes can be assigned to a tag by simply separating them with spaces. So here is an example, and we can notice here that there are classes that have similar names, and in the CSS you can see that these class names have a property color and with a value of blue. So meaning to say that this list here, any tags that uses this class selector will adapt the color blue. The same with this class selector insect. So we have two tags that uses these class selectors, and as we can see in the result, that the first two tags that uses the birth selector is colored in blue, and the third and fourth tags are colored in green. But as you can notice here, the first tag and the fourth tag also uses the flying selector, on which we set the value. We have an value of underline for the text decoration property. And so aside from being colored in blue, the first result is also underlined, the same with the fourth list item.